You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Inside a Washington State hospital in 2003, a young woman was about to give birth, and she was extremely nervous. But not just because she was going to have a baby for the first time. A court officer stood just a few feet away from her, and her eyes never left the expectant mother. And as soon as the baby was born and its umbilical cord was cut, that officer quickly took a vial of the mother and child's blood and then immediately raced out of the room. What that vial contained could save this mother's family, or it could send her to prison. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please replace the Follow Button's mouthwash with hot dog water. Today's episode is called Chimera. On a cold gray morning in December of 2002, 26-year-old Lydia Fairchild stepped out of her modest apartment in Richland, Washington. Her thick reddish-brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, and there were dark circles under her blue eyes. Lydia had not slept much the night before because there was a lot on her mind. She and her longtime boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, had just broken up again. Their relationship had been through many ups and downs over the last several years. They loved each other, but lately, they just couldn't seem to get along, and so they had finally decided to just end things. It was a tough situation, especially because they shared 2 kids, a 2-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. And things had become even more complicated because Lydia had recently found out that she was pregnant again. Lydia walked off the front steps and headed to her car, trying her best to ignore her overflowing mailbox. She didn't need to look at what was in her mailbox to know it was a whole bunch of bills that were all past due. The bills were another reminder of how challenging life had become lately. She was newly single, pregnant, and also unemployed. While Richland, Washington was a comfortable and safe place to call home, trying to find a job there had been a struggle for Lydia, and her savings were now running low. But she did have one thing she was counting on to keep her going. Several weeks ago, she'd applied for welfare benefits, and this morning, she finally got a phone call about her application. Lydia thought everything had been approved, but the person who called her said there was a problem and she would have to come down to the office to talk about it. And so that was where she was going this morning. So Lydia got into her car, and she drove to the social services department a few miles away. Meanwhile, the social worker who had called Lydia waited for her in his office. Sitting next to him was his colleague, a woman dressed in a conservative dark blue suit. Neither of them said very much. They were too focused on studying Lydia's case file. The two of them had seen hundreds of welfare applications over the past few years, but never one like Lydia's, and so they were very curious to see what she would have to say. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and Lydia entered. Once she sat down, the social worker who had called her got right to the point. There was a problem with the DNA tests that Lydia and her kids had submitted in order to receive these welfare benefits. The results showed that Lydia was not actually the children's mother. For a long moment, Lydia didn't say anything. Then she let out an awkward laugh and told them there had to be some mistake. But the social worker shook his head. DNA testing had a 100% accuracy rate. Lydia just sat back in her chair with this look of total disbelief in her eyes. And it was at this point the social worker's colleague, who was dressed in the dark blue suit, finally spoke up and introduced herself. She told Lydia she was not a social worker, she was a lawyer, and she was with the prosecutor's office. The lawyer got right to the point. Lydia had clearly committed welfare fraud. She had claimed children that were not hers as dependents on her welfare application, and this was a serious crime. And so the lawyer asked Lydia point blank if she was trying to pass these kids off as her own in order to collect a higher welfare payment. And Lydia said no, of course not. Then the lawyer suggested that Lydia must have stolen someone's identity. But Lydia immediately pulled out her driver's license, which had her name on it and all of the information she had included on her application, and Lydia promised the license was real. Lydia insisted that her kids were her natural-born children. She claimed she even had proof since she had their birth certificates and the baby's footprints from the hospital. The lawyer flashed a worried look over at the social worker. Technically, they both knew it was possible that Lydia could have given birth to these kids without actually sharing their DNA, but that could only happen if she was a surrogate mother. And the social worker realized that if that was the case, that could open up a whole other set of very dark possibilities. Lydia could have been paid to be a surrogate, and then when she actually delivered the kids, she could have kidnapped them from their real mother. If that was the case, this situation could go beyond welfare fraud. The real mother could be out there somewhere desperately looking for her kids. Or even worse, perhaps the mother was harmed. The social worker cleared his mind and tried to stay objective. Lydia's horrified reaction to all of their questions made it hard to believe that she was some hardened criminal. But the best scammers could be great actors. And in his career, the social worker had seen plenty of criminals put on Oscar-worthy performances. Finally, after Lydia continued to deny that she had done anything wrong, the social worker and the lawyer told her that she was free to go. But as she gathered her things, the woman from the prosecutor's office gave her a dire warning. Prosecutors were preparing a criminal case against her, and they could take her kids at any moment. Lydia's hands were shaking as she drove home from the interview. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that she had to get home and figure out what to do next. Lydia rushed through the front door of her apartment and called her mother, Carol. Carol tried her best to calm Lydia down, reminding her that the stress would not be good for her current pregnancy. Lydia promised she would try to relax, and admittedly, it did make her feel better just to talk to her mom. After they hung up, Lydia took a deep, calming breath and then started looking for evidence that could help prove her side of the story. She dug up the children's medical records and birth certificates. She grabbed photos of her with the babies. Then she set it all aside to present to the prosecutor. She was sure it would convince the authorities that she really was the real mother. The next day, about 600 miles away, inside of a prison in Montana, an inmate was lying on his bunk bed. The gray-haired 50-year-old man looked up when he heard the familiar sound of a guard rapping on the bars. The guard told him that someone named Carol was calling him. The inmate's name was Rod Fairchild, and he was Lydia's father. Carol was Lydia's mom and Rod's ex-wife. If she was calling, Rod knew it meant something was wrong. Rod sat up and followed the guard to the prison's call center. The moment he picked up the receiver, he could tell that Carol was very upset. She told him everything that was happening to Lydia, that she was in trouble over a DNA test and was now being accused of committing welfare fraud. Rod told her to stay calm and that he was sure there must have been some mistake, and he was positive it would all get cleared up soon. But after the call ended, Rod dropped the optimism he had shared with Carol. As he headed back to his cell, he couldn't help but think about the DNA evidence. He wanted to believe his daughter, but he knew DNA didn't lie. And if she tried to fight DNA evidence in court, he was afraid she would lose. As her father, Rod felt terrible about the whole situation, and he even felt a little bit guilty. After all, he was serving time for business fraud, and now his daughter was in trouble over welfare fraud, and so he knew he had not set a great example for his child. Either way, Rod wondered if his daughter had gotten herself into trouble and was now trying to cover it up. The following week, the prosecutor, who was now in charge of Lydia's case, was busy building a case against her. He had to be absolutely certain that there had not been an error with Lydia's DNA test. Although it was highly unlikely, Lydia's samples could have been accidentally switched with someone else's, or maybe they had been tainted somehow. So just to be safe, he ordered Lydia and her kids to come in and submit 3 more DNA samples for testing. It took a few months to process the tests, but sometime around March of 2003, the prosecutor had his answer, and it was exactly what he expected. The prosecutor phoned Lydia to tell her the results. According to this second round of testing, Lydia was still not the children's biological mother. Lydia insisted these results were wrong too, and she began to argue with the prosecutor. She asked if the authorities had seen the birth certificates, the baby footprints, and all the photos of her with the kids. The prosecutor told Lydia that yes, they'd seen them, but it didn't matter. Nobody was denying that she gave birth to the kids. They're denying that they are her kids. At this point, the authorities were convinced that Lydia was running some sort of surrogacy scam. With the newest rounds of DNA tests in their hands, they had everything they needed to convict Lydia. The prosecutor informed her she'd be receiving a court summons and advised her to hire a lawyer. Lydia hung up from the prosecutor in a total daze. She knew she was in deep trouble. Lydia didn't have any time to waste, so she pulled out a phone book and started going through the yellow pages looking for family law attorneys. She explained her situation to each one, but they all said the same thing. There was no sense in fighting DNA evidence, and so none of the lawyers she contacted would agree to represent her. They knew they would lose. By the end of April, when Lydia was 8 months pregnant, she was a total nervous wreck and basically wasn't eating. She had to borrow money since she never got her welfare benefits, and she couldn't get a job because of all the legal trouble she was in. Her first hearing was in a few weeks, on May 16, 2003, and somehow she'd have to argue her case in front of a judge without a lawyer. On May 16, 2003, Lydia's case went to court. This was a preliminary hearing to determine what would happen to her kids while her case proceeded. The judge overseeing the hearing sat in his chambers, reviewing the evidence against Lydia. He thought it was the strangest case he'd ever seen. The prosecution wanted to put her son and daughter in foster care, and it was now up to him, the judge, to decide. He put on his robe and walked into the courtroom, curious to meet the mother. Lydia, who was now 9 months pregnant, struggled to stand up when the judge entered the courtroom. When the judge sat down, he took a closer look at Lydia. She looked ready to give birth at any moment. The judge asked Lydia when she was due, and she told him she was scheduled to be induced into labor in just 3 days. The judge thought about this. Taking the kids away from her at this point, even if they were not technically her kids, seemed unnecessarily cruel. And so he told Lydia that he was prepared to let her keep custody of the kids for the moment, but he had conditions. He needed her and the newborn baby to submit a fresh round of DNA samples. A court officer would literally be present for the birth of this third kid, and the second that baby was born, they would take its DNA to be tested. The following Monday, May 19, 2003, Lydia checked into the hospital. She was induced into labor, and sure enough, the court officer who was in the room witnessed her give birth to a baby boy, who Lydia named Jamie II after her former boyfriend and the father of the baby. As nurses huddled around the newborn, the court officer tapped a lab technician on the shoulder. Before Lydia could hold little Jamie for the first time, the tech drew a vial of blood from the baby. He handed the vial to the court officer, who promptly turned and headed for the door. Before the officer left the room, she looked back for a moment. As Lydia now cuddled with her newborn son for the first time, it was hard for the court officer to believe that this woman was anything but a genuine loving mother. The officer looked down at the vial in her hand. It would prove whether Lydia was this baby's biological mother, or if she was really the scheming liar that prosecutors claimed she was. 2 weeks later, the results from Lydia and her new baby's blood tests came back. It showed that, once again, she and her child did not share any DNA, so she could not be the baby's biological mother. Prosecutors were more sure than ever that Lydia was in fact running some kind of surrogacy scam, Now Lydia was in even bigger trouble than before. And without a lawyer, she ran an even bigger risk of losing her case. Just a few days after Lydia's newest DNA results came back showing she was not the biological mother of her newest baby, a 41-year-old attorney named Alan Tyndall sat down at his cluttered desk with his morning coffee. He had a stack of paperwork that he was not looking forward to doing that day, so when his secretary patched through a potential client, he was happy to take the call. It was Lydia, and as Alan listened to her story, he wasn't sure what to make of her. Like any good lawyer, he knew DNA evidence was the gold standard. But Alan enjoyed a challenge. He was a proud military veteran and former public defender. He was used to taking on tough situations. Alan was especially curious about Lydia's most recent DNA test. To his knowledge, the only way a woman could give birth to a baby that was not hers was if she was a surrogate. But Lydia said she wasn't, and this child and the other two were really her biological children. Alan had never heard of someone successfully overturning DNA evidence, but he believed everyone had a right to legal representation, and somehow he believed that Lydia had to be telling the truth. And so he told her he would take her case. With Lydia's next court date looming, Alan got straight to work. He spent long nights at his office looking for any logical way to defend her, but he kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was no fighting DNA evidence. After several weeks, Alan was still no closer to finding a way to defend Lydia, until one morning, his secretary brought him a recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. It came with a note from a colleague. There was an article they thought could be relevant to Lydia's case. At first, Alan shrugged it off. Lydia's case was starting to make the local news because it was so unusual, and so as a result, Alan had been getting a lot of unsolicited advice from people who had seen her story on the news. But Alan was not making much progress on his own, so he picked up the thick journal and started to flip through it. And by the time he got to the end, his eyes were wide. He could not believe what he had just read. It was a long shot, but if what he had read was true, it could be the key to winning this impossible case. Alan's first step was to convince the judge to postpone the trial. He explained that Lydia needed to undergo more in-depth testing to try out this new theory he had, and it could take months to get the results. The judge agreed to delay the court date until April of 2004, nearly a year away. Alan was confident that would give them enough time. And so right away, he sent Lydia off to lab after lab where she underwent a battery of tests. Then they waited. Almost a year went by, and Alan was still waiting for the results, and the date for Lydia's hearing was fast approaching. One night, Alan was in his office working on his opening statement for Lydia's case when his phone rang. It was the doctor overseeing Lydia's lab work, and he told Alan he had some bad news. There was still too much data to analyze, and Lydia's test results wouldn't be ready in time for her hearing. Alan could not hide his disappointment. This was a huge setback, but he knew the judge wouldn't delay the trial any longer. And so, in April of 2004, Alan and Lydia walked into the courthouse where her trial would finally take place. Once they were seated, Alan leaned over to reassure her. Then he stood up and faced the judge. Alan didn't have the science-based evidence that he'd been counting on this whole time. What he had instead was a very strange story to tell, and everything in the whole case came down to whether he could get the judge to believe it. He began to explain why a schoolteacher who lived 3,000 miles away in Boston, Massachusetts, and who had never met or even heard of Lydia, could prove his client was innocent. That schoolteacher's name was Karen Keegan, and in the late 1990s, Karen was sick and needed a kidney transplant. Hoping her sons would be a match, they all took a DNA test. And just like Lydia, the results showed there was a 0% chance that Karen was the mother of her kids. But unlike Lydia, Karen was able to find out why. A Harvard doctor looked into her case and suggested an extremely bizarre scenario. Karen was something called a human chimera. This condition was named after a creature from Greek mythology who had a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So basically, it was several different animals rolled into one. When a woman conceives twins, it's because 2 eggs in her womb have been fertilized. On extremely rare occasions, the 2 eggs then fuse a few days after fertilization, and when that happens, the resulting embryo becomes one fetus with 2 different genetic codes. This is a human chimera. And once it's born, different parts of its body have unique strands of DNA. That explained why Karen Keegan didn't come up as a genetic match for both of her sons. The sample they had tested came from her other set of DNA. But then they tested different parts of Karen's body, her hair, her skin, even her bladder, and eventually they found DNA that did match her sons, and it came from Karen's thyroid gland. Allen argued that Lydia had to be a chimera too. Essentially, he was telling the judge that Lydia was her own twin. And because of this, samples may have been taken from a part of Lydia's body that had a different set of DNA than her kids. Unfortunately, they still had not found any tissue within Lydia that matched her kids' DNA yet. But they did have something. Allen had gotten Lydia's mom tested, and that test proved that at least she, the mother, shared DNA with Lydia's children. That meant either Lydia or Lydia's sister had to be the kid's mother. The judge took a moment to digest the evidence. If all his years on the bench taught him one thing, it was that DNA tests were always right. But Allen's argument was very compelling. Then the judge made his announcement. He told the court he believed Lydia Fairchild was indeed the mother of these kids. In his opinion, the story of Karen Keegan, paired with the new DNA results of Lydia's mother, proved that Lydia had to be a human chimera. And so the judge dismissed Lydia's case and admitted that he was wrong. After almost 2 years, Lydia's ordeal was finally over. She burst into tears as Allen put his arm around her. She had been telling the truth, as crazy as it sounded, the whole time. A few months later, doctors were able to finally show that Lydia's DNA did match her kids. They found the matching DNA from a cervical smear. Lydia Fairchild went down in textbooks as only one of 100 human chimeras ever identified. And while her ordeal would forever haunt her, it did bring her family closer together than they ever had been before. Lydia and her ex-boyfriend, Jamie Townsend, did get back together long enough to have a 4th child. This time around, because the world knew that Lydia was a human chimera, nobody questioned if she was the mother. 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field, and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewi. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewi's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewi last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewi relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewi on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewi's belongings inside, Siraji said, "Okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make." And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewi, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery, out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway and he saw that Kristen wasn't home and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the two of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in, and then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again, and then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table. And then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode,
dansen in het licht van de maan. Laat de zomer nooit meer weggaan. De rivier stroomt, het water is zo koel. De kinderen spelen, duiken in het poel. De geur van bloemen, het geluid van de wind. Elke dag een avontuur zoals we het beminnen. Als de zomer komt, voel ik me vrij. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. We dansen in het licht van de maan.
episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. If you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put the brush back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On the morning of July 30th, 1976, a young doctor examined an elderly veteran at Bloomsburg Hospital in Pennsylvania, desperately looking for a way to keep this man alive. His lungs were filling up with fluid, but no matter how many times the doctor drained them, the fluid just kept coming back. The man suddenly began to spasm in his bed, coughing up a bloody pink froth. Dr. Ernest Campbell tried to stay calm, but he knew he was running out of options. He'd seen people die from respiratory failure before, but this had progressed faster and more suddenly than anything he'd ever experienced. And this patient was only one of several in the hospital with the same disturbing symptoms. In fact, Dr. Campbell had heard about similar cases appearing across the entire state, and so he was terrified that this was the onset of a deadly epidemic. And if it was, there might be no way to stop it. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please gift the follow button an all-expenses paid vacation, but be sure you book them in a hotel that is known for having bedbugs. Today's episode is called The Philly Killer. The temperature was closing in on a hot 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as Ray Brennan pulled open the heavy glass door of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on July 21st, 1976. But the heat outside was the last thing on Ray's mind. He was just excited to be here at the Pennsylvania Convention of the American Legion, the nation's biggest veterans group. Ray, a retired Air Force captain, was now back among his people. Ray was 61 years old, and he had never married, but in some ways, he was married to the Air Force. His career spanned more than 2 decades, from the eve of World War II until 1960, when heart troubles forced him to retire. He never saw combat, but he helped save lives by running hospitals for wounded airmen in the Korean War. Ray walked a little taller when he was at these conventions. He knew that to an outsider, this gathering of more than 4,000 Legionnaires might look like a bunch of older men and women with graying hair, a lot of them wearing uniforms that didn't fit quite as well as they used to. But Ray knew that the people in the huge marble lobby in front of him were the everyday heroes who had risked their lives serving their country from World War II to the Vietnam War. And Ray was one of them. To all these veterans, he was Captain Ray Brennan, bookkeeper for American Legion Post Number 42, in Towanda, Pennsylvania. As Ray straightened his shoulders and began his first round of handshakes with old friends, he felt a twinge of regret. Ray knew that if he had not had that second heart attack in 1960, he'd still be on active military duty until mandatory retirement at 64 years old. Still trim and fit, Ray was sure he still had what it took to wear the uniform. But Ray gave himself a shake to snap out of it. He knew he had a good life. Even his years out of the military were not so bad. A passionate seashell collector, Ray had been asked by the Smithsonian Institution to help organize the National Shell Collection. He even got a seashell named after him. And anyway, Ray had been looking forward to this convention for months. and now that he was actually here, he didn't want to waste time regretting the past. For the next 3 days, Ray had a great time, telling stories, listening to speeches, and catching up with people he loved over dinner and drinks. Then, on July 24th, he made the 180-mile drive back home to Towanda, a town of 3,000 people near the New York border. 2 days after he had returned from the convention, Ray was sitting in his kitchen, still talking about the convention to his sister, Maisie Travis, when suddenly, Ray stopped talking mid-sentence and clutched his chest. He had the shooting pain that felt almost like it was burning, and it left Ray breathless and struggling to keep from falling out of his chair. His sister, Maisie, dropped her newspaper and grabbed her brother by the arm to steady him, and she said she would call Ray's doctor right away. But Ray really didn't want the help. He was terrified of having another heart attack, but this pain, it just felt different. It felt like his heart was just racing. He was sure it would just pass. Shuffling slowly into the living room, Ray collapsed into his favorite armchair, and he told his sister that he was just worn out from all the socializing and eating too much rich food and staying up too late swapping war stories, and that he really just needed to close his eyes and let this thing pass. And before long, Ray fell asleep. But when he woke up from his nap, Maisie could tell that Ray was worse, not better. His face was pale and it was getting harder for him to breathe. By the afternoon, he was literally gasping for breath, which really frightened Maisie. So Maisie sat down next to him in his armchair and insisted that he go to a hospital. Ray still hated the idea, but his breathing was getting so labored that he was getting scared too, and so he reluctantly agreed. They slowly walked out to her car, and then after getting inside, Maisie drove him to a hospital in the next town over. When they arrived, a nurse immediately placed an oxygen mask over Ray's nose and mouth. Then she took his temperature and saw that he was running a fever of 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The nurse helped Ray onto a gurney and wheeled him into the emergency room for more tests, which would include chest x-rays. Ray felt grateful that he could just lie down. A little while later, Maisie stood at Ray's bedside and held his hand as an emergency room doctor walked in with a very concerned look on his face. The x-ray they had taken showed that Ray had a dangerous buildup of fluid in his lungs. That's why Ray was gasping for breath. The doctor asked Maisie to please step out for a moment, and then once she had, the doctor told Ray that he was going to drain the fluid in his lungs himself. The doctor helped Ray sit up and lowered his gown to expose his ribcage, and then the doctor grabbed a long hollow needle from a nearby instrument tray. Ray winced in pain as the doctor inserted that long needle between Ray's ribs and into the space around his lungs. And then soon, the doctor was using that needle to suction out some of the fluid, relieving the pressure Ray was feeling. And for a few minutes after this procedure, Ray breathed a lot easier. But it didn't last. Within a half hour, Ray was gasping again and spitting up pinkish foam from deep inside of his lungs. The doctor drained the fluid again and again, but each time the liquid came right back. The doctor had never seen anything like it. It was almost like Ray was drowning in his own fluids. The doctor explained to Maisie that her brother's heart condition had already weakened him, and now his respiratory system was crashing and there was little doctors could do if they couldn't remove the fluid. His condition would only get worse. And so the doctor told Maisie that he did not think Ray would live much longer. Maisie choked back tears as the thought of losing her sweet-natured brother sunk in. Ray had always been so careful of his health ever since his heart problems forced him to retire young. How could he now be at death's door? Less than a week later, and 80 miles away, Dr. Ernest Campbell stood in an examination room in Bloomsburg Hospital. His patient, a 48-year-old World War II veteran named Sam Morris, was running a high fever and having difficulty swallowing. Dr. Campbell feared that Sam might have typhoid fever, a brutal and extremely rare disease that often comes from swallowing sewage-contaminated water. Campbell had seen a lot of this disease when he was working for the Peace Corps in Kenya, but it was almost unheard of in the United States. The doctor asked Sam what he'd been doing prior to getting sick, and Sam would say that he had attended a convention in Philadelphia, and while he was there, he suffered a terrible headache and decided to come home early. As he spoke, Sam mentioned that 2 other veterans who'd attended the same convention had also been admitted to Bloomsburg Hospital. In fact, he'd seen one of them being wheeled past his room. Maybe they should be checked out too, Sam suggested. Dr. Campbell paused for a moment, wondering if there might be a link between the 3 men's illnesses. After he finished examining Sam, the doctor looked up the other 2 veterans. He found that they all had very similar symptoms, and one of the men, an 82-year-old widower named Bill Baird, was even sicker than Sam. It was all but impossible for all 3 men to have typhoid fever. Campbell knew something else, maybe something doctors had never even seen before, was preying on these men. Dr. Campbell consulted with the other men's doctors and ordered the same tests for all 3 veterans. The lab promised they would get the results back as soon as possible. But before the results came back, the elderly veteran, Bill, got worse. No matter what Dr. Campbell tried, Bill's lungs kept filling up with bloody foam. Dr. Campbell felt powerless as he watched his patient's life drain away. And then early on the morning of Friday, July 30th, Bill died. He'd only been in the hospital for a couple of days. Later that day, Dr. Campbell was back in his office, trying to figure out how to treat the 2 remaining veterans in his care. He was just thankful that the 2 patients were younger and stronger than Bill had been. He hoped their bodies would be able to fight off the disease on their own. While Dr. Campbell looked over their charts, a nurse knocked on his door. She had the veterans' test results. Dr. Campbell eagerly grabbed them from her, desperate for any indication of what he was fighting. But as he looked the results over, Dr. Campbell's hope drained away. The results were inconclusive. There was nothing telling him how he could treat this mystery disease. Dr. Campbell realized he was not capable of tackling this disease on his own. Whatever had infected the veterans was extremely deadly. If it was contagious, it could be the start of a massive epidemic. He put down the test results, then picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number for the federal health authorities. He knew he had to get through and tell someone before this situation got even worse. Dr. Campbell had barely put the phone down before the news media began to hear rumors about a mysterious disease that seemed to be striking veterans who attended this American Legion conference in Philadelphia. The COVID pandemic was decades in the future, but even then, the public was anxious about the possibility of a disease that could spread wildly, potentially killing millions of people. The Chicago Tribune newspaper compared this Philadelphia outbreak to a popular movie at the time, The Andromeda Strain, that imagines a disease from outer space that comes to a small town on Earth and sets off a tidal wave of sickness and death. And so after that news story broke, doctors all across the country started getting all these calls from patients reporting respiratory symptoms and wondering if they too had the mystery disease. Many did not. They just had chest colds, but their panicky calls jammed up the emergency lines from coast to coast. 3 days after Dr. Campbell called for help, Dr. David Sensor rushed through the front doors of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. The CDC was home to the world's foremost disease detectives, with a mission to prevent outbreaks both in the United States and also abroad. The 51-year-old head of the agency, Dr. Sensor, had gotten word over the weekend of an emerging health crisis in Pennsylvania. Dr. Campbell at Bloomsburg Hospital was one of the first people who had called it in. The CDC took Campbell's call very seriously, especially as a flood of other calls about sick veterans around the state poured in. Despite the early hour, the building was buzzing with activity. Phones were ringing off the hook, and staff were running around passing documents to each other. Dr. Sensor reached his office, where several senior officials were waiting for him. He sat down at his desk, and they briefed him on everything they had learned. Over the weekend, a mysterious epidemic had spread like wildfire. So far, the agency knew that a total of 37 people throughout Pennsylvania had been hospitalized with headaches, chest pains, fever, and lung congestion. 13 of them had died. Dr. Sensor rubbed his forehead and let the information sink in. He asked if they'd made any progress on identifying the cause of the disease, but everyone in the room just shook their heads. They didn't even know if this disease was caused by a bacteria, a virus, or something else. The only thing they knew was that almost everyone who got sick had attended that veterans conference at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel from July 21st to the 24th. But this clue only raised more questions. not everyone who was sick had actually been inside of that hotel. A bus driver from western Pennsylvania who had simply dropped passengers off in front of the hotel and a female bank teller who worked across the street from the hotel had both died that morning. Neither of them had entered the hotel or participated in the conference, but they both shared the exact same symptoms as the veterans. Dr. Sensor frowned. He knew there was no way this was a coincidence. If other people had contracted the disease by just being near this hotel, it meant that whatever was infecting people was highly contagious. An outbreak like this could be catastrophic. His thoughts of a worst-case scenario were interrupted when another health officer walked into his office. This officer had just talked to a representative from the veterans group that had hosted this now infamous convention. Another man had apparently just died. Now, 14 people were dead from this mystery illness. The officer handed Dr. Sensor several autopsy reports, and as he read them, Dr. Sensor's face drained of color. The reports described the victim's lungs as being covered in a thick, bacteria-filled layer that looked like Brillo pads. This layer prevented some antibiotics from penetrating the lungs, which made it very difficult to treat this infection. And so, with medicine basically unable to help fight this disease, the victim's only slim hope was for their own bodies to somehow overcome the attack on their own. Dr. Sensor looked up at all the people gathered in his office, and he wasted no time telling them what to do. They had to get a team of scientists to Philadelphia as soon as possible and find out what was killing so many people. That evening, one of the CDC's senior investigators, a 32-year-old man named Dr. Fraser, broke through a gauntlet of reporters posted in front of the CDC headquarters. They shouted questions at him, but Dr. Fraser kept his head down and walked past all of them. He didn't have any answers yet, and he didn't want to give out any wrong information. But he hoped that would change soon. Dr. Fraser was going to lead 20 members of the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service to investigate this outbreak. This would be one of the most intensive searches for the cause of a mass outbreak in world history. Whatever the disease was, it was moving fast. In the few hours since Dr. Sensor had ordered Dr. Fraser to assemble a team, 10 more people had died and 39 more were seriously ill. Dr. Fraser met Dr. Sensor in a quickly assembled war room filled with photos and maps of the area and victims, nearly all of them being military veterans. After Dr. Sensor gave him an update, Dr. Fraser outlined his plan for the investigation. He would lead one team in Philadelphia, collecting samples from the hotel, while another team would travel throughout Pennsylvania, interviewing patients who had been hospitalized with this disease. He was confident that they would be able to figure out any common patterns between the various patients and find whatever was causing this. Dr. Sensor agreed that this was the best approach, and so he shook Dr. Fraser's hand, wished him luck, and sent him home to pack.
De wind fluistert zacht door de velden heen. De wolken dansen in de blauwe lucht. Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw plaats zo puur. In elke bloem, in elke boom. Oh, natuur, jouw hart zo groot. Jij bent de ziel van ons bestaan.
The next day, Dr. Fraser and his team of investigators wore gloves and protective masks as they entered the grand lobby of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Just 2 weeks earlier, it had been packed with veterans and their families. Today, it was nearly empty, except for a few startled-looking staff members. Dr. Fraser figured that nobody wanted to stay at this hotel until the cause of the outbreak was identified. The investigators' footsteps rang out on the marble floor as they walked to the reception desk and explained their mission: to gather physical evidence inside of this hotel that could be tested for the disease. The team went to work. Dr. Fraser instructed them to gather samples from every surface and object in the hotel. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small plastic test tube. He unscrewed the top, which held a cotton swab soaked in a special solution. He carefully rubbed the swab on the reception desk and then placed it back into the test tube and labeled it. He wasn't going to overlook anything. Throughout the lobby, the EIS investigators were doing the same thing. One of them was on his hands and knees, painstakingly swabbing different sections of carpet. Another woman pulled off air conditioning grates to check the vents. Once they were done in the lobby, Dr. Fraser and his team went through every location in the hotel that had been used by the veterans during this convention. They swabbed door handles, elevator buttons, and furniture. They moved through the hotel's kitchens and bars, swiping the insides of water pitchers, coffee pots, and silverware. They collected bits of food and the ashes from the bottom of ashtrays. And then several hours later, Dr. Fraser led a team up to the roof of the hotel, 20 stories above the city. The hot August sun beat down on all of them as they scraped up bird droppings next to a large cooling tank. Dr. Fraser thought that sick pigeons might have carried the virus and maybe somehow transmitted it to the veterans, and so that's why they had to check the droppings. A little while later, the team was relieved to return to the cool lobby of the hotel. They sealed their samples in a container to be sent back to the laboratory for examination. The answer to what caused the deadly disease had to be somewhere inside one of those test tubes. Once the samples were collected, they were sent straight to the CDC's lab in Atlanta. Dr. Sensor had assembled some of the country's best scientists to test them for every disease imaginable. One of those scientists was a young microbiologist named Joseph McDade. Dr. McDade specialized in animal-borne illnesses, and it was his job to test for rare diseases such as Q fever, which could be transmitted from farm animals like goats, sheep, and cattle. So far, there wasn't any evidence that the veterans had interacted with any of those animals, but Dr. Sensor didn't want to take any chances. Unfortunately, Dr. McDade couldn't just look at the samples under a microscope and see if the bacteria that caused Q fever was present. There would be too many other microscopic organisms present. Instead, he had to isolate the bacteria and get a big enough sample to examine. It was an absurdly drawn-out process. First, Dr. McDade had to take lung tissue from someone who died from the mystery disease, inject it into the abdomen of a guinea pig, and then wait for 2 weeks. If the animal developed a fever, that likely meant it had Q fever. Dr. McDade thought Q fever was a long shot, but he agreed with Dr. Sensor that it was important to rule out every possible disease. So he went ahead and started the testing process. And much to his surprise, the guinea pig did come down with a fever, but it came down with it after only 2 days, which meant this disease wasn't Q fever, it was something worse. But when he looked at the samples under the microscope, Dr. McDade saw nothing. Except for a few scattered bacteria, the sample was completely clean. Just to be sure, he repeated the process, testing for other types of bacteria, but nothing showed up. Dr. McDade assumed that whatever was causing the guinea pig's fever was not a bacteria, but figuring out what it really was landed outside of his expertise. And so he passed along his results to Dr. Sensor, hoping someone else could make more sense of it. If they didn't, he wasn't sure how they'd solve the deadly infection. But over the next few weeks, no answer emerged. On August 20th, 1976, so almost 3 weeks after the first cases of this mystery disease were reported, CDC head Dr. Sensor sat in his office in Atlanta. He looked at the inconclusive test results that were spread across his desk. Despite the CDC's best efforts, they weren't any closer to solving this mystery. Dr. Sensor had other teams scour over Dr. McDade's guinea pig's bacteria samples, but nothing out of the ordinary had appeared. David Fraser's samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel had also revealed nothing, and they had conducted extensive interviews with patients to check for commonalities, but those interviews had not offered any new clues either. Although they'd been able to rule out certain diseases like typhoid, the plague, and miscellaneous viruses, they were no closer to figuring out what was causing this outbreak. Aside from a few bacteria that naturally occurred in the environment, they had found no evidence of anything unusual. And in the meantime, people kept getting sick. All told, 226 people had been infected by this mystery disease, and the death toll had now climbed to 34. The public was getting more scared by the day. An assistant brought in a stack of newspapers and magazines. Dr. Sensor groaned when he saw the headlines. An article from Time magazine called the disease, quote, the Philadelphia killer, end quote. The CDC's inability to provide an answer to the terrifying illness only fueled people's fears, and some began to turn to conspiracy theories. Dr. Sensor eyed the thick stack of pink messages on his desk. The CDC had been flooded with calls ever since the investigation began. People from all over the country phoned in with questions, tips, and general panic. Some wondered if it was an attack from a foreign adversary. Even the FBI had called. While there was no sign it was an act of bioterrorism, it couldn't be completely ruled out either, and that made people nervous. Dr. Sensor couldn't blame them. But after launching the largest medical field investigation in its history, they had hit a brick wall. There were no more samples to test, either from the hotel or from sick patients. David Fraser's team in Philadelphia had done everything they could to investigate the outbreak. The only silver lining was that the number of people becoming ill had abruptly stopped, which meant this mystery illness was not transmissible from person to person, and so the general population was not in any danger of a massive pandemic. But Dr. Sensor didn't take much comfort from that. Without knowing what was behind this disease, there'd be no way to stop it if it happened again. Still, he was out of ideas. Dr. Sensor let out a deep breath and picked up the phone to call Dr. Fraser. It was now, unfortunately, time to call off the investigation. Five months later, in December of 1976, Joseph McDade, the microbiologist who had conducted the Q fever tests, poured himself a drink at a holiday party in Atlanta. Dr. McDade was ready for the year to end. The past few months had been deeply frustrating. Ever since the investigation had been called off in August, Dr. McDade and his colleagues at the CDC had been under severe scrutiny. The head of the CDC, Dr. David Sensor, had even been accused by Congress of running a sloppy investigation. Public confidence in the health organization was at an all-time low, and Dr. McDade didn't know how they could get anyone to trust them again. As Dr. McDade chatted with some friends, someone tapped him so hard on the shoulder that he almost spilled his drink. Dr. McDade turned around and saw that it was one of his neighbors. The man was red in the face and he was holding a glass of whiskey in his hand, and so Dr. McDade could tell, this guy was drunk. But before he could say anything, the neighbor jabbed Dr. McDade in the chest with his other finger and said he knew Dr. McDade worked for the CDC. Then the neighbor ranted about how badly the CDC had failed the American people, and that people like him, Dr. McDade, were why the Philly killer had claimed so many lives. Dr. McDade took a step back, totally stunned, and then before he could respond, the neighbor had turned and walked away. Dr. McDade turned back around to his friends, but he couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. He wasn't angry at the confrontation. The man had been harsh, but he was right. Dr. McDade felt an overwhelming sense of failure for not being able to help crack the case. For the rest of the week, that feeling of failure stayed with Dr. McDade until he couldn't take it anymore. One day during the week between Christmas and New Year's, Dr. McDade headed to his lab at the CDC. No one else was there. Dr. McDade stood alone in a dark room surrounded by lab tables and microscopes. A string of blinking lights on the ceiling and a half-empty gift basket were the only reminders that it was the holidays. Dr. McDade wanted to look at the tissue samples again from Philadelphia just to kind of clear his conscience and make sure he didn't miss anything. So he pulled out the samples that he'd tested back in August, and he slid them one by one under the lens of his microscope. And once again, they were completely clean, except for a few stray bacteria shaped like little rods. Over the summer, he'd assumed these stray bacteria had accidentally gotten mixed into the samples. It was impossible to avoid some level of contamination. Now, Dr. McDade wasn't so sure and wondered if there was more to them. He grabbed a few more slides from deep storage that he hadn't examined before, but they all looked the same. There were just a few rod-shaped bacteria floating around in each sample. But then, Dr. McDade examined one last slide from the lung tissue of a deceased veteran, and when he looked at it, he saw something that shocked him to his core. There weren't just a few of the rod-shaped bacteria. There was a giant cluster of them, far too many to be random contaminants. The answer had been in front of him the entire time. These little rod-shaped bacteria that he had written off had caused the outbreak. But before he could tell anyone, he had to be 100% sure he was right. So Dr. McDade grabbed more slides from the freezer and started running more tests. 2 weeks later, in January of 1977, Dr. Sensor sat in his office, eager to hear what Joseph McDade had apparently discovered during the holiday break. And Dr. McDade would announce that he had identified the actual organism responsible for the outbreak. He described his findings to Dr. Sensor, who was totally stunned. They had tested for every disease they could think of, but even the CDC's top minds could never have guessed it would be something like this. Dr. Sensor agreed that Dr. McDade's discovery was a significant breakthrough, but they needed to gather more samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel just to be certain. And so, a few days later, Dr. Sensor sent out one more team of medical detectives to Philadelphia. And during this search, the crew went straight to the roof of the hotel, and there they took a sample from a very specific area. And there, on a cold winter day 6 months after it first started, the mystery was finally solved. The Veterans Convention had taken place in July, a hot and sticky month in Philadelphia. The hotel's cooling system ran full blast for the 3 days of the convention. The cooling towers up on the roof were old and hadn't been maintained recently, allowing the water inside that was used for air conditioning to grow warm and stagnant. It had created the perfect environment for new bacteria to thrive, in a thin coating of slime commonly known as pond scum. Normally, the bacteria in pond scum doesn't make people sick, because people don't inhale it. That's why you can usually swim in lakes, ponds, and other freshwater sources without coming down with this particular deadly disease. It's only deadly if it becomes aerosolized, which means being turned into a spray. And in the summer of 1976, that's exactly what happened. When the hotel's air conditioning system kicked on, the bacteria, which had grown in the cooling tower's warm water, was transported down through the system's pipes. It was then sprayed out as cooled air all over the thousands of veterans inside the hotel. Everyone who inhaled the air at the convention was breathing in bacteria-ridden water droplets. That included people like the bus driver and bank teller who had both died. They hadn't even gone into the hotel, but they had been exposed to the infected mist that had come off the cooling tower and fell onto the sidewalk below. Not everyone who inhaled the mist got sick, including most of the hotel's employees and other guests. This was likely because they were younger or did not have any other health risks that made them more susceptible to this bacteria. Now, nobody knew about this deadly mist because right after the convention, the air conditioning filters at the hotel had been cleaned. That's why the team of EIS investigators didn't find bacteria when they scoured the hotel for samples. But after Joseph McDade's discovery, they finally tested the cooling tank's interior, which had been missed before when they were doing all those samples. In the slime coating on the inside of the tower, they found the deadly bacteria that Dr. McDade had originally seen under his microscope. This bacteria was named Legionella in reference to the convention's attendees, the mostly male veterans who were all members of the American Legion. The condition they developed is now known as Legionnaire's disease, and while there are still occasional outbreaks today, thanks to the efforts of the CDC, Joseph McDade, and even the angry neighbor at the holiday party, this disease is now treatable and much less fatal. But that all came too late for Captain Ray Brennan, the conference attendee who had to retire early from the service because of his heart issues. Surrounded by his 2 brothers and 4 sisters, including Maisie, Ray died just before sunrise on July 27, 1976, holding one of his beloved seashells in his right hand. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but he went down in history as the primary criticism of virtually every paranormal story out there is a lack of credibility. Either the person claiming the events happened lacks credibility themselves, or you just don't have any other corroborating evidence, like other people that witnessed it, other credible people that witnessed it, or in many cases, a lack of video or photo proof that said paranormal event happened. But in the case of the story today, you not only have a highly credible witness, a NASA robotics engineer, you also have other corroborating witnesses that are from that NASA engineer's family that were there and witnessed it with him. And you have, albeit limited, you do have video footage of what they are claiming happened that was paranormal. But before we get into all of that in today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's your thing, if you could gently pulverize the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my uploads every week. All right, let's get into it. Bill Vail has always been incredibly scientifically minded. He's always had technical jobs his whole life. He took a job for 15 years at NASA as a robotics engineer. He also spent a little time as a pilot for NASA as well. He is just somebody that is very process oriented. And in fact, his family and friends, they say this with respect, but they say that, Bill, he lacks an imagination. He's super pragmatic, super to the point, and doesn't really have time for, call it, creativity. He's all about facts. In 2002, Bill and his wife separate, and it catches Bill a little bit off guard. And it almost prompts like a midlife crisis for him where, before it had been really his work with NASA that had been fulfilling to him. And now he has this huge gap in his life. And suddenly, he's looking around and he's like, what am I doing all this for? I don't have a family anymore. Like, what am I doing? And so he decides to move back home to Arlington, Texas, where his little brother lived. So when he gets to Arlington, he feels like he can have a fresh start in a way. He has family around, so he doesn't feel quite as lonely, and he actually just takes a job at his brother's water purification company because he wasn't sure what he was going to do. He just knew that he needed to do something. So he gets a job at this water purification company, and he starts working with his brother, and he finds that even though it's not the same type of work that he was doing as a robotics engineer at NASA, it was nice to be working day in and day out with a family member. So Bill has only been living in Arlington for just a couple of months, and he had only been at the water purification company for maybe a couple of weeks. And so when a Saturday house call was called into the company and no one really wanted to do it, Bill thought, you know what, I'll take one for the team, make a good impression on my coworkers, and I'll take the house call. And what it involved is part of Bill's job was to go demonstrate how to install and use this water purification system in customers' home. The dispatcher for the water purification company said to Bill, she goes, hey, listen, this is a little bit weird, but the person who called was adamant that you be there at 5 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. And it was probably only about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he's like, so what do I do? And she's like, I don't know, go get a bite to eat and just make sure you're there by 5. And so he does that. He's like, that's weird. But he drives around and he parks outside of the house a little ways down the street. And a couple minutes before 5, he gets out and he starts heading over to the property to do this house call. He starts walking up the path to this big brick house at 4:59, and as he's getting closer to the steps, he can hear through the front door, which he can already tell it's slightly open, it's not latched all the way. He can hear screaming inside of this house. It sounds like a woman screaming, and it actually sounds like she's screaming, get out of here. But he doesn't really know what to make of it. He has a job to do, so he walks up to the door, and even though it's open, he knocks. And now he can literally hear through the crack in the door that someone in this house is screaming. And he's listening, and finally he decides, well, I should probably just open it up and make sure everything's okay, because I can hear someone screaming inside, the door's open. So he opens it up and he walks inside. He takes one step inside of the residence and just kind of peeks around, and he can see a little bit down the hall off to the right, there's an opening to a room. And in the room are 3 men on their knees in a little circle, and a woman is walking around them in a circle, and she's holding a book in her hand, and she's speaking in tongues. Just nonsensical, couldn't make sense of her language, but periodically as she's circling them and she's touching each of their heads, she's screaming, get out of here. Leave these people. Get out of here. Bill is about to leave. He knows that this is just too weird for him, but right before he does, the woman who's walking around the 3 men on the ground looks up at him and points directly at him and doesn't break eye contact and just holds her finger out pointing at him. And he gets this very strange sense that this woman wants to do harm to him. And so he just runs out the door and is like, yeah, I'm not going back in there. Goes back to his car and he calls the dispatcher back at the water purification company. And he's like, okay, I just took an insane house call. The lady in there is crazy. I'm not doing it. Don't reschedule. And if you do not put me on it because I will not go in there. Bill was a very straightforward guy. And he's just not going to let his imagination run wild with what they were doing. You know, those people are crazy and that's not my business. It's not my problem. And so he forgot about it. He just goes home to his house and he turns on the TV and he gets his microwave dinner and he's just sitting there eating his food and just having a nice Saturday night to himself, when out of the corner of his eye in his other room, and I keep in mind, Bill lives alone and has no pets. Out of the corner of his eye, he thinks he sees something small dart across the ground. He couldn't tell if it was flying through the room or if it was running through the room, but he just was like, oh, now I got, some rodent or a bird or something in my house. It must have snuck in through the chimney. And so Bill is not scared. He's mostly like frustrated that now he has to deal with some rodent in his house or some bird in his house. So he puts his food down and he turns on all the lights because he was watching TV with the lights off, turns on all the lights and just searches his house. He's like quiet, listening, trying to like hear where the thing went in his house, and he can't hear anything. And after over an hour, he just decides, well, geez, I don't know where it went. I don't know what it was. Maybe I didn't even see it in the first place. So that night, he wakes up suddenly to what feels like some small creature running over the foot of his bed, but like over his foot. And it instantly wakes him up and he instinctively sucks his legs up to his chest under his covers. As pretty much anybody would do when some random creature is running on your feet in the middle of the night. And he's like, great, this thing, it's probably, now you can tell it's a rat, it's a rodent. He's like, great, now it's literally in my bedroom on my bed. And so he flips on the lights and now he's just mad because this is right in the middle of the night. It's the last thing he needs. And he lights on and he searches the room. He looks under, his dresser, he looks in the closet, he looks under his bed, he looks everywhere. And he can't find this thing. He's stopping periodically to listen and he can't hear scurrying or anything. Did I imagine that as well? Because I guess I don't know if I saw something darting out of the corner of my eye when I was watching TV. I think I did. And just now, could that have been in my dream? Because he wasn't really awake for it happening. He woke up to it and thought it's what happened. And so he's starting to like tell himself that, you know what? I'm somehow creating this weird thought in my head. Like I probably didn't see anything downstairs and I was probably having a dream about this, rodent in my house, and that's what prompted the thought that something had touched my feet. And so he's like, all right, whatever. Turns off his lights and he goes back to bed. So Bill falls back asleep, but shortly thereafter he wakes up again when his bed is violently shaking. And he wakes up and his bed's shaking and it stops almost immediately once he's awake. And he thinks that they're having an earthquake. So he jumps out of his bed and he's looking around to see if like things are going to start falling on him. He runs to the window. He looks outside. He can't tell what's going on. He runs into the other room and he can suddenly tell, because he's in a bit of a panic, that there is no more shaking happening. Now, the shaking's done. The house is totally silent. And he runs back to his bed and he has this thought like, could I in my sleep have shaken my bed? And he had one of those huge 4-poster beds and he's like trying to move it, and Bill's a big strong guy and he can barely move his bed, and he has this memory of my bed was literally shaking. And he's like, now this is 3 times that something strange has happened and I can't make sense of it. And being a very kind of pragmatic person and not one with, as his family said, a wild imagination, he did not have that. He's like, okay, let's find out if there was an earthquake. So he goes online and he starts researching earthquakes. And he's thinking maybe if the earthquake had just happened, that the news would break right then and there, some headline. There's nothing. And so he's like, okay, what other rational things could have caused my house to shake? Because again, there's no other damage in his house. Nothing fell. It was just, he felt the shaking and that was it. And so he starts researching like what's in the area, and he finds that there was a military base, and actually it's an air base right near his house, a couple miles away. And he's thinking, okay, well, when the fighter jets are taking off, that take off at all hours, maybe there's a sonic boom from one of the jets accelerating. And he didn't know if that was it, but he thought it could be it. And then he's like, oh, well, there's also all these oil rigs that are drilling in the area. Maybe there was an accident. So he's researching for, recent accidents at oil rigs. And he's trying to find a rational explanation for this bed shaking incident. He also can't help but feel like, what happened with that thing I saw that was like touching my feet? Like, he's not connecting the two events, but he has this weird sense that either something's wrong with him and he's losing his mind, or something really weird is happening in his property. So as he's trying to find this rational explanation, his internet goes out. And so he tries troubleshooting it a couple times, but he can't get it to work. And so he calls his service provider to just have them see if they can fix it. And so he calls customer service, somebody picks up, and they're like, yep, your internet's out, let me fix it for you. Let me put you on a brief hold. And so they put him on hold, and as he's sitting there like listening to elevator music, like staticky sound started coming through the receiver, and he's just noticing it. It's nothing significant. But then a voice comes into the phone that is speaking in tongues, like nonsensical language, and it sounds almost threatening. At some point, Bill is just totally unsettled by this voice because it's just going on and on. He's been on hold now for like 2 minutes of this weird voice. He just hangs up. And like in just a couple of seconds, he gets a call back from the same customer service rep that he had just been speaking to. And he had an accent, and Bill picked up on it and said, hey, was I just talking to you? And the customer service rep was like, yes, sorry, we got disconnected. And Bill says, did you hear that voice? Did you hear that strange voice on the phone? And the customer service rep, who's mostly operates on a bit of a script, kind of deviates for a second and says, actually, yes, I did hear that. And I was actually trying to figure out how that could have been possible, because we use a very secure phone line when we talk to our customers, and there's really no way for someone to actually block my ability to speak to you. Like, even if someone was on the call, you would still be able to hear me, and I was trying to yell to you and you weren't hearing me. So I don't know how that would have happened, but I definitely heard the voice. I don't know what that was, and we're so sorry. So both of them are definitely weirded out by it, but you know, the customer service rep, he's got a job to do, and he's like, hey, your internet works again, thanks, talk to you soon. He hangs up, and Bill's left with his internet working again, but now that's the fourth strange thing. He has the thing that runs across the room as he's watching TV. He has the thing that ran across his feet at night. He has his bed shaking, and now he has this like devil voice speaking in tongues on the phone that the customer service rep also heard and couldn't make sense of. He decides to, you know, I'm done doing research for the night. It's, 3 a.m. or whatever it was. I'm gonna just try to get a couple hours of sleep because this is just starting to freak me out a little bit. So Bill gets back in his bed and he's trying to sleep, but he can't stop thinking about the fact that there have been 4 strange occurrences in the span of just a couple of hours. And he can't help himself but start to feel a little bit worried that something that he doesn't understand is going on, something bad is going on. And as he's sitting there desperately trying to sleep, he swears he can hear some sort of sound underneath his bed. He knows it could be his mind playing tricks on him, but it doesn't matter. He thinks he hears it, and it's now he's officially spooked. Like a child, he pulls the covers over his head, and he's just laying on his bed with the covers over his head, just basically trying to convince himself like this isn't happening. There isn't anything under your bed. Just relax. Nothing's happening. He's got his legs sucked up, up near his chest. He's just under his sheets. And the way he was positioned is he had left a light on in his room, and there was a light basically beaming down onto the sheet that was over the upper part of his body. So there's a little bit of light into the cavern under his sheets. And so he's holding it up over his head. And as he's sitting there, like trying to tell himself that nothing's going on, he looks down towards the foot of his bed, under his covers, right? And he sees a hand slowly reaching up from the side of the bed, come up and try to grab his foot. And it just misses and then retracts out from under the bed. Bill literally leaps out of bed, flips on every light, and is now in just absolute crisis mode. He immediately is like up against the wall, doesn't even want to look under the bed, but eventually he does. He kind of pokes under, nothing's down there. He looks around his room, there's no sign of anybody in the room, and now it's like, okay, you've had so many strange occurrences, and none of it makes sense. Like, what are you going to do? And he had no idea. So Bill does not attempt to go back to bed that night. He goes downstairs, flips on every light in his house, starts drinking coffee like he's awake. He's like, I'm not doing this tonight. And so he stays up the rest of the night. So the next day, Bill just tries to have a normal day. He doesn't want to think about what happened the night before. So he goes to work like normal, doesn't tell anybody about it. Again, Bill, he's a straight shooter. He's not about to be, the former NASA robotics engineer that's like, hey, let me tell you about the paranormal stuff that's happening in my house. He's doing everything he can to not think like that. And so by the end of the day, he started to feel a little bit of anxiety as he's getting ready to go back to his house, because he would have to potentially face some of the strange things that happened the night before. They could happen again tonight. And so he gets home has all his lights on. He's not about to keep his lights off. And he's sitting in his chair he always sits in, the same one where he was watching TV and saw that thing dart across the room. He's sitting there and he's eating his microwave dinner and he's watching TV. Again, all the lights on in his house. And he looks down for a minute to get another bite of food. And when he looks up, a bottle is zinging towards him. And he moves his head out of the way and it hits the wall beside him and it breaks. It's a glass bottle and shatters on the ground. And then all the lights in the house go out. So Bill runs to the closet where he knows he has a flashlight. He opens it up, reaches for the flashlight, and as he's about to pull it out, he hears in the closet, towards the top of the closet, this loud slamming sound. And he had a couple pretty heavy boxes on the very top shelf in his closet, and it sounded like someone had almost lifted one up and then slammed it down on the top shelf. But obviously he didn't do that, and it totally freaked him out. He grabs the flashlight, shines it in the closet. There's no one in there. There's nothing in there. And he backs out, and then the lights come back on. And his heart's racing because he knows what just happened. Someone just threw a bottle at his head. Someone just slammed something in his closet, and he's in full panic mode. And so the only person he can think to call is his brother, because he's not prepared to go to the police, because the things he would need to describe are kind of nonsensical sounding. But his brother, who's very rational, equally kind of pragmatic in his approach to everything. He calls his brother and he's like, get over here. I got some weird stuff happening in my house and I just need a sanity check. And so his brother, Bob, his younger brother, Bob, he comes over. And as soon as Bob gets there, Bill is like, he had never had a discussion about the paranormal with his brother before. So he's just like, all right, this is going to sound weird, but Bob, I need you to just go in this closet and just go in the closet. And Bob's like, what in the world are you talking about? And Bill's like, please, just go in there. I'm going to shut the door and I want you to just tell me what happens. And so Bob's like, all right. Bob goes in the closet. Bill shuts the door behind him. Bill's just out there waiting. And Bill calls to Bob, hey, turn off the light. There's a little pull string, little tiny light bulb. Turn off the light in there. So, Bob's like, all right. Turns off the light and it's pitch black in there. And so at the time, Bob would not tell Bill what happened to him in the closet. Mostly because if you put yourself in Bob's position, he doesn't have any of the context. He doesn't have anything that happened. He's never experienced anything like this before. And so what he experiences, he kind of chalks up to probably his own doing. He doesn't think that someone did it to him. And so what happens is he's in the closet and he feels something hit his leg. And he thinks, oh, I must have knocked into something that hit my leg, like a pair of shoes or something. And he's just standing there, and then something hits him hard in the face, and he thinks, oh, I must have hit something on the top shelf that fell and hit me in the head. But the two things combined, it did unsettle him a little bit, and he consciously decided, I'm not gonna tell my brother Bill that this happened because I'll only feed into his own paranoia right now, and that's not what he needs. Opens the closet, gets out, and he's like, you know what, Bill? Nothing happened in there. You got nothing to worry about. There's nothing in here. And so he leaves, and Bill is left kind of crestfallen because he feels like he really didn't do a good job conveying to his brother just how much had happened in the house so far. He basically said, I've heard some strange noises, go in the closet. And then nothing really happened. So he feels like out of his element. He just feels like he doesn't know how to handle it. And so he has only one other person that he feels comfortable kind of letting in to this situation, because it was just kind of embarrassing for Bill. I mean, he's this esteemed NASA employee. The last thing he wants is to have somebody think that he's like losing his mind a little bit. But he has his friend Michael, who is a sound engineer that worked for a couple podcasts. And when he calls him, Bill doesn't even really know what he's going to say to Michael. He just needed to talk to someone, like a friendly voice kind of thing. And he calls him, and Michael's a little bit surprised to see Bill calling him, and they have a little bit of small talk. And Bill says to Michael, I don't know how to approach this with you, but I moved to Arlington, and I got some weird stuff going on in my house, and I guess I'm just telling you because I don't know what else to do. And so Michael's like a little bit caught off guard and is a little bit just worried about his friend. And he starts asking him some basic questions, just, oh, well, what have you heard? Like, what have you seen? Just not really sure if it's even remotely worth exploring, but just asking some basic questions. And as they're having this exchange, the voice that came on the phone during the call to the customer service rep for the internet provider came on the phone. And all of a sudden, Bill can't hear Michael, and Michael can't hear Bill. All they both hear is this voice, this like angry, kind of demonic sounding voice that sounds very threatening. And so while this is going on, Michael just instinctively is like, well, I have all my sound set up here, and he grabs a mic and he puts it to the receiver and starts recording. And for a minute and a half, he sits there recording this voice. And then about 30 seconds into the recording, not that Michael could hear it, Bill on the other end, who's heard this voice before, and he's starting to get the feeling that this whole thing is bad. Like it's bad. And he starts yelling to Michael to hang up. Don't listen to this. Hang up the phone. Don't listen to the voice. He's yelling for him. And then after about a minute and a half of this chaos that Michael's recording, the voice suddenly stops. And it goes back to Bill and Michael talking to each other. And it's like crystal clear. And so Michael immediately says, hey, Bill, you there? You there? And Bill's like, yeah, I'm here. I was trying to get you to get off the phone. You can't listen to this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's bad. And Michael just goes, no, listen, I recorded that. Here, let me play it back for you. And so he starts playing it back, and it's silence. Except for when Bill was yelling to Michael, don't listen to it. Hang up, don't listen to it. And Michael is yelling in the beginning to Bill like, hey, what is that? What is this? But then it's all silence in between. So they aren't speaking to each other, even though they're on the phone with each other, and they hear something, but the recording only picked up their voices, not the demonic, possessed sounding voice. At this point, Bill is starting to get a little bit scared. Maybe he wouldn't admit to it, but he's alone in this house and all this strange stuff is happening, and he just decides that he's going to invite his brother over for dinner. And Bill is in the chair that he always sits in, and Bob and his wife Cindy are on the couch, and they're kind of having a nice time. Bill recalled feeling, it was just nice to have other people in the house. And they're watching TV, and as they're watching TV, suddenly Bill just stands up and kind of runs over to the room where he had originally seen that thing dart by, this rodent or whatever he saw. And Bob and Cindy obviously see him get up and run over, and they're like, hey, what did you see? What was that? And Bill's like, okay, I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I saw this thing that's in my house. And, Bob, I brought you over here because I've just been seeing this animal or something running around my house, and I swear I just saw it. And he goes, hey, look, Bob, sit in my chair, because it was the only vantage point into this room. The couch where Bob and Cindy were sitting, they couldn't really see into this room. And he goes, just listen to me. Bob, sit in my seat and just sit here and just watch the TV. Don't pay attention to the room. Just watch the TV and just see if something catches your eye. Because, maybe I'm seeing something that is totally rational, but something's happening. Just do what I was doing. And so Bob's like, all right. So he sits in the chair. Bill sits next to Cindy, and they start watching TV again. And Bob, all of a sudden, just clearly reacts to seeing something in the other room, and he goes, oh my God, what is that? And they all stand up, and Bill is like, well, what'd you see? And Bob's like, I don't know. It was like some kind of small animal or something, and it looked like it was on 2 feet. It did not look like a 4-legged animal. That's like a 2-legged animal. Like, what was that? And so Bob, he's now feeling like, I was in that closet, some weird stuff happened that I didn't tell Bill about. Now this, and he's like, okay, Cindy, his wife, Cindy, you sit in the seat. You do this now. And so now Bill and Bob are sitting on the couch watching Cindy, and Cindy's watching the TV. Of course, in just a matter of minutes, she sees something dart across the room. Now, was she just kind of jumping on the bandwagon because these two saw it? Maybe. But she certainly described the same thing that Bill and Bob claimed to have seen, which was a bipedal, small creature that was just running through the dining room. And so the three of them turn on all the lights, and they start searching the house. They're going to find this animal or thing in the house, and they search everywhere for hours, and they can't find anything. Finally, after it's getting late, Bob and Cindy are like, hey, Bill, I don't know what's happening in your house, but why don't you just come stay with us? We got a guest room. Just crash with us tonight, and you can come back in the morning and call animal control or whatever you want to do, but just you shouldn't be here tonight. There's too many weird things happening here. Bill, in a way, was actually kind of happy because now he had someone that he trusted and loved, his own family, that had confirmed that they were seeing the same things he was. That even though that is terrifying, that all of a sudden Bill is alone in this house with some creature, this small bipedal creature running around the house, at least he wasn't losing his mind. Or if he was, at least other people were too. So he was kind of relieved, and he was like, you know what? I'm not going to go with you because I don't want to just give up my house. what will I do when I come back if it keeps happening? Like, I don't want to just give this up. So Bob and Cindy leave, and now Bill is determined to now, for the first time, start looking up paranormal explanations for what was happening. So quickly, Bill realizes that you can't just search the paranormal. There's too many things online. It's so hard to tell what is considered like credible and what isn't, because there's just no fact checking going on. It's just people kind of putting things on the internet. And so what he decided he would do is, instead of him doing the research, he would find a paranormal investigative team that at least appeared to approach their investigations much the way a scientist would. That instead of looking for proof, the paranormal exists, instead that their approach would be like looking for an answer, even if that answer was totally normal. And so he starts researching for investigative paranormal teams that have a scientific focus that are in Texas in the area. And he actually finds one, and he reaches out to them, and they were actually available that night to come over. So he says, please come over, I need your help. So the leader of the paranormal team was a man by the name of Brian Hall. And when they get there, it's Brian and a couple of his crew members. They don't start with, diving into the paranormal investigation side. They start by looking for obvious answers, because they've found that many times when someone claims they have a paranormal event happening, it's something like, a bad AC unit, or a creaky door, or a branch outside that's rubbing against the house. And so they did a very lengthy and thorough examination of the outside and inside of the house, looking for things like that. And they determined that there wasn't anything obvious that was a rational explanation, so now it warranted setting up some equipment. And so what they did is they set up a couple of cameras in Bill's bedroom, where a lot of the activities apparently was happening, and they set up these laser beams that basically beamed lasers in every direction, and they would place them in his bedroom. So there was like laser beams all over the room, and if anything walked past any of these lasers, you would see the beams move, and it's very obvious. So it's a way to detect motion in the room. And so they set these beams up, and they start filming, and for a long time, nothing is happening. Bill, Brian Hall, the team are just sitting in the dining room downstairs, just like listening to silence and watching nothing happen. And so Brian suggests, hey, why don't one of his team members go up and just literally interact with the room a little bit? Go in there, kind of like yell, do something, kind of stir it up, so to speak. And then we'll see if anything happens. And so one of the team members goes up to the room and walks in and is like, hey, is anybody in here? And, nothing's happening. You can see on the footage that, he jumps onto the bed and he's sitting on the bed. And at some point, as he's yelling out to whatever was in the room, like, hey, if you're in here, show yourself, all of a sudden on camera, you hear a laser fall. And he jumps out of bed and he runs out of the room. And the rest of the team comes up and they gather up the cameras and they immediately watch the footage. And as they're watching the footage, you can see this mist that begins to form in the room that the team member who was in there just didn't see. And the mist starts swirling in front of the laser beams on the camera before you hear off camera one of the laser beams falling to the ground. So at first they're just kind of dumbfounded, and they're like, well, how did the mist get in there? Like, what is that? And is it possible that perhaps the laser beam rolled off a table or something? Maybe it was positioned in such a way that it could have rolled off. And so what they did is they raised the sound levels inside of the actual video, and they made out a couple of words. And so at this point, Brian Hall and his team feel like they have quite a bit of data that actually does lend credibility to the idea that there is something paranormal happening in Bill's house. So as they're packing up to leave, they say to Bill, like, you gotta go. You can't be here. Like, I'm surprised you're still here now. And Bill just was this super prideful guy, and he just was like, no, I'm gonna stay. Like, I've made the decision. I'm not gonna run. I'm gonna stay here in this house. And they're like, that's a bad idea. And honestly, they were right, because some pretty horrible stuff happens after they leave. So that night, he knows he's not gonna sleep. So he has all his lights on in his bedroom. He's sitting with his knees tucked up to his chin. He has upbeat music, like classical music, but very upbeat music playing on the radio right next to his bedside. And he's just trying to kind of create good vibes in his room. And so as he's sitting there, he hears what sounds like a Mack truck smashing into the side of his house. Like, it was so loud and just deafening that he instantly sprints out of his door, runs downstairs, runs outside to inspect the damage to his property. and nothing's outside. There's nothing. There's no Mack truck. There's no damage to his house. There's nothing. He walks all around his property. He's like, did something fall in the street? Am I losing my mind? Like, what's going on? And so he goes back in the house after quite a bit of looking around, seeing if something might have fallen off of his roof that made a sound. Nothing. He goes back in his house, and as soon as he steps foot in his house, he hears a similarly loud crashing sound, as if, a vehicle is smashing into his house, except it's inside of his house in his dining room. It was in the same room where he first initially spotted that thing running across the ground. And so he runs in there to look for some horrible damage to the inside of his house, but there's nothing disturbed. There's nothing shaking. There's nothing out of place. His dining room is intact. And as he's sitting there, he hears his car alarm go off outside. And now he's thinking, this thing is screwing with me. I'm not going to let it win. I've stayed here against better judgment for multiple days. I'm not going to give in now. And so Bill kind of goes into fight mode. Now he's mad. And instead of being scared of what's happening, he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, like, show yourself. And so as he's doing that, he hears yet another loud crashing sound up in his bedroom. And so he runs upstairs ready to fight with whatever this is in his house, because it's gotten to a breaking point for Bill. He charges in his room. There's nothing in there. But unlike the dining room, and unlike when he was outside, the crashing sound continues while he's in the bedroom. So he's standing in his bedroom, holding his ears from the deafening crashing sounds over and over and over again, but there's nothing moving. There is no way for the sound to be emanating from that room, but it is. And after what feels like an eternity of this horrible smashing sound, it just completely stops. And it's dead silence. And Bill lifts his hands off his ears and he's looking around, and he's expecting it to start again, but it doesn't. And it's just dead silence in the entire house. After quite a while, and he still doesn't hear anything, he gets back in his bed. All the lights are on. His radio's on. And he tucks his legs up to his chin, and he's just holding himself basically in the fetal position. And he is, at this point, he's now just petrified. He had his big fight moment, but I think he's now thinking that this thing was just challenging me back. It's basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you, and you can't touch me. I can do whatever I want, you can't touch me. And he's realizing that maybe he could have made it worse, and he's sitting there knowing he's not going to sleep. It's still the middle of the night, and he starts hearing a noise that sounds like maybe shuffling of feet. Something's moving around underneath his bed. And as he's sitting on his bed, at the head of his bed near his pillow with his feet tucked in, he looks at the foot of his bed, and this huge, just wide, 6-foot-tall black figure emerges it's bright in the room. This black figure emerges at the foot of his bed. It's got this huge tooth coming out of its mouth, and it gets into this jerky position and starts moving towards Bill, and it gets right in front of him, and it puts its face right against Bill's, and then grunts and then disappears. Bill continued to see this horrible black figure in his house, and it continued to kind of challenge Bill, and Bill stopped challenging it back. And so Bill started waking up with these scratches on his chest. He was hospitalized a couple of times, prompting the hospital to do welfare checks on Bill because he was showing up with these mini heart attacks because of the stress that he claimed was from having this stuff happening to him. And his family's so concerned. And it wasn't until Bill started really doing some aggressive research on demons that he read about exorcisms. And he remembered that when he showed up for that house call, a lot of the language that he was hearing coming from that woman who was screaming, leave these people, leave this house, it sounded like an exorcism. And he was thinking that, do you think it's possible that the exorcist knew that she needed another host for these demons? And so she planned it so that she would have this water purification person show up right at 5 p.m. so that she could be at the part of her exorcism where she could cast the demons onto him. After 2 exorcisms of his own to his house, it still hasn't stopped. He's still, to this day, is dealing with the paranormal activity in his house. And when asked why he hasn't sold his house, is he thinks that he couldn't live with himself if he ever put another person through what he has dealt with at his house. I don't know about you, but I would not have lived in that house for an additional 18 years. That just sounds like the worst. But, I'm not Bill, and so he's made up his mind that that's what he needs to do. But for me anyways, I would have left that house. I would have abandoned that house more than likely. But I'd love to hear what you would do in that situation, and I'd love to just